So, as we said in our previous session, the Talmudic statement that there was an oath that God made the Israelites take not to climb the wall is specifically referring to that time when the Romans forbade the Jews from coming into Eretz Israel. So that is, besides the discussion of rabbi-toledano, that was the original intention of the Midrash. What happened was that because of the historical circumstances, the Jews who lived under Christianity felt more compelled by that decree, whereas Jews who lived in outside Eretz Israel and had better relationship with the nations that surrounded them, slowly did not, I would say forgot, but did not put emphasis on that. That is one part. There's another part to that. So Jews who remained in Israel became part of the Holy Roman Empire, and even at one point, the Julian the Apostate, the emperor who went against Christianity within the Roman Empire, gave the Jews around the 3rd century Jews permission to rebuild the temple. It didn't work out. There was another attempt. There was an attempt to build the temple in the 3rd or 4th century. It didn't work out because the same Julian who parted ways with the Christianity didn't get along with his mother, who was a very devout Christian. I think his name was Theodosia or something like that. And he sent her to exile. But unfortunately, the place that he chose for her to be exiled to was Israel. So she came and really worked the room, right, going around and provoking the Christian leaders there, and managed to stop the movement for building the temple. Some, I think, also attributed to her is the naming of all the holy places in Israel in the last journey of Jesus, Golgotha and Via Dolorosa, etc. Anyway, it didn't work out, and the Jews who stayed in Israel were under the rule of the Roman Empire, and in the year 420, around mid-400s, the Roman Empire also forbade the existence of the Nesiut, of the presidency. Up until the time, they had a president, they had a president of the Bedin, the chief judge of the Bedin. They had autonomy, but the Romans stopped all that. And as a result, the remaining Jews in Israel were always oppressed by the Christians, and felt indeed that oath applies to them, because there's no way that they can rebel against the nations. And meanwhile, the other major Jewish community was in Babylonia or in Persia, under the rule of the Persian Empire, which became the Achaemenids and the Sassanids and all that, which were relatively benevolent towards the Jews. They were not. They practiced some sort of paganism. There was Zoroastrianism that is in one way similar to Gnosticism. It's the idea that there are two deities, one the evil God and a benevolent God, and the Jews were weary of that religion, and they had some tensions. I'm not saying there were no persecutions. There were cases. There was the King Shapur II in the 5th or 6th century that massacred Jews. But in general, the Jews under the Persian and then under the Muslims in that area enjoyed great freedom. When we spoke about the Gaonim, that is later on 7th to 11th century, we're talking about yeshivot that were self-standing, and in terms of they have their autonomy, they raise money from all over the Jewish diaspora. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak is famous as the judge who worked with the royal court. They have an exilarch, a prince who is the head of the Gola. It's a completely different status. They have the sort of the free people versus the the subjugated people. So that contributes to the development of that mentality among Jews of Eretz Israel, who later on become sort of the spiritual ancestors of Ashkenazi Jews, because the first Ashkenazi Jews came to Germany from Italy, from the city of Bari. That several families came from there, and those families in turn were very connected to the center in Eretz Israel. So we have this kind of spiritual ancestry. That is one element. The other element, also extremely important, is the whole concept of martyrdom in the Christian theology. This is something that from the very beginning Christianity has championed, the idea of dying for God, and the idea that God Himself died for humanity. What greater sacrifice than that? If according to the theology, God is embodied in a human being, came to this world to suffer and die as a human being in order to atone for the sins of humanity. That's the greatest sacrifice. And then everyone who died in the same way, the martyrs in the first centuries of the Common Era under the oppression of the Romans, died by the hundreds, if not by the thousands, and all the martyrs later on become saints, and the saints become part of the pantheon of the Christian world. Jews who live in Christian lands, when they come to Germany, that's where the Ashkenazi branch of Judaism starts in the 9th or 10th century. When they come there, they see the imagery and they see the depictions in pictures, in mosaics outside the church. The art is everywhere, and the sermons are also there, because the preachers talk to the crowd and they say, these are the killers of God, and they put them down. And the Jews who are now being alienated and isolated have this feeling of, not only we are victims, we are controlled by people who are able to show this great sacrifice for God. Where are we? How is it possible that we are not doing the same thing for God? This is where the problem started. So those are two things that contribute to the rift between the Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews in terms of how do you see your interaction with the non-Jews. Add to that the fact that when the Muslims invaded Spain in the 8th century, they appointed the Jews to be their representative and administrators, and that is the beginning of the Golden Age in Spain until Reconquista in the 13th century. The Jews had a couple of hundreds of, or 400 or 500 years in Spain of great prosperity and intellectual freedom, whereas in Germany and in Western Europe they did not have that. So all this comes down through the ages to a mentality of we have to suffer in certain places, and to seeking out those sources in the Talmud or in the Torah that explain why this is happening. So it's a vicious cycle. It's you look at the verse that could be interpreted in different ways, but because you are already in a certain state of mind, in a physical state, you take it to mean something else. So then we digress a little bit from Rabbi Toledano's discussion, but it was important to highlight that midrash and the way it was interpreted throughout the ages. So now I'm going back to the text of Rabbi Toledano. It's in his Shelot Utshuvot Yam HaGadol in chapter 97. So he writes this: Af begalut Mitzrayim שנאמר בה ועבדום ועינו אותם בדרך גזירה וחיוב. He says there's one exception of all the exiles when he said that God did not command us to suffer. He says there is one exception. The one exception is the time that we spent in Egypt. And regarding that time, we have the famous covenant called the covenant between the pieces, between Abraham and God. And in that covenant, God tells Abraham, you should know that your descendants will go to a land that does not belong to them, and there they will become slaves, and they will be enslaved and tortured. And that is written it is phrased as a decree and as an obligation. They must be tortured, they must be enslaved. But even there, rabbi-toledano says, Amru Razal, shekosh shi'abud ishlim minyan 400 shana v'yashvu rak redu shanim. That because the slavery was so harsh, instead of 400 years, they only spent 210 years in Egypt. Just as people are released from jail earlier for good behavior, they were released earlier because they suffered so much. וגם אז ראינו שמשה רבנו עליו השלום, כשראה איש מצרי מכה איש עברי מאחיו על מגן, הרג אותו. When Moshe saw that an Egyptian taskmaster is beating a Hebrew man for nothing, this word al magan is in Aramaic. In Aramaic, magana is for no reason or for free, depends on in the context. And Moshe killed him, ki yada she'en ze bichal shi'abud. And Rabbi Toledano touches here about an interesting question, which is, really what happened with Moshe. Again, this is sort of a side issue, but it's important to understand that Moshe when he comes out of the palace, he comes with such a conviction that he must help the Jews, and he saves the slave from the taskmaster. But then when he's accused by his brethren that he's trying to take over, he runs away. And even when God tells him, I want you to go back and help your brethren, he refuses. What happened to him? So I think that what happens with Moshe is being raised in the palace as the adoptive child of Pharaoh, he doesn't have the slave mentality. So he's the perfect person to come and try to organize a rebellion, an awakening. And that is what he was trying to do. Not kill one person, not to kill one taskmaster, but send a message to his brothers, get up and rebel. You can't be controlled thousands or hundreds of thousands of slaves by a few guards. But they told him, don't shake the boat, don't rattle the social order as it is now. We enjoy what we have, because at least we have the safety and security of food and shelter. And there is a hierarchy within slavery that we also enjoy. And that's why he runs away. He says they're not ready, they don't want to be redeemed. So when God comes and says, I want to send you, he said, they're not going to listen to me. God says, you will perform a miracle and it will happen. So Moshe answers, then you don't need me. You are going to take them out. Just perform a miracle and bring them out. And the answer of God is, I still need you because you care. Even when it is a miracle performed by God, you need a leader who cares and who believes in the mission or in the outcome. So Moshe really shows the people, and it's an important example that Rabbi Toledano shows. Moshe shows the people that don't think that because there was a prophecy that said that you must be enslaved, that you have to be enslaved. You are allowed to get up and rebel. Don't let it become a self-fulfilling prophecy. V'chen begalut Yisrael befaras, and that also happened in Persia. כשראו אסתר ומרדכי גזירת המן להרוג ולהשמיד, לא השתדלו לבטל את הגזירה דווקא. When Esther and Mordechai saw that there was a decree by Haman to destroy the Jews, they didn't try necessarily to override the decree, אלא גם הפילו פחדם על הצוררים להשיב מכה אל מכיהם ויעשו בשונאיהם כרצונם. They took an offensive and they fought back against their enemies. Now, the truth is, when you look at this text in Megillat Esther, that the first attempt of Mordechai and Esther was to override the decree. They asked the king, once they were able once Esther, she was the manipulator, and very, very wisely, she was able to orchestrate everything to the point where the king says, "What is it that you want? I will give it to you." And she said, "I want you to nullify, to recall the decree of the war against the Jews." And the king answers, "I cannot do that. That cannot be done because the כתב אשר נכתב בשם המלך ונחתום בטבעת המלך אין להשיב." You cannot return, you cannot reverse a royal decree. So they did try to do that. But what Rabbi Toledano is pointing out, that they were not only lobbyists. They, from the very beginning, first of all, they worked behind the scenes to orchestrate a situation where they have the say, and they really had the upper hand. They were able to bring to execute Haman. And then, when they saw that there's no way to reverse the decree, they said, "Okay, let us have a permission to fight against our enemies." So he shows that being proactive is the right approach. So you see, very systematically, Rabbi Toledano first analyzes the situation. He goes through the history of mentality of subjugation. What is it based on? He shows the verses in the Tanakh and the Talmudic sources, and then he shows the contradicting evidence from the Tanakh that shows that you are allowed and obligated to fight against your enemies. V'gam begalut Sfarad. Now he moves from biblical history to medieval history. Yadua she'arav Asar Avarbanel tikes עצה עם גדולי ישראל בספרד. It is known that the Don Yitzhak Avarbanel was I don't know what he bases it on. It is possible that they were planning to fight with their enemies, but it was torpedoed by a convert to Christianity, who revealed the secret. This could be an exaggeration, but because we don't know that the Jews had a military prowess, that they were able to fight against the Spaniards at the time of the Inquisition. What we do know is that under the Muslim rule, there were Jewish generals, most famous of whom was Rabbi Shmuel Halevi ibn Nagrila, known also as Rabbi Shmuel Nagid, who was the general of the Sultan Habus of in Granada, and led his armies to war successfully. He even there's a poem that he wrote when he was at battle, and he said, "I didn't have time to pray Minha. I couldn't focus on Minha, so instead I composed this poem to serve as a prayer." So they did have this kind of autonomy. And also he says, "V'korot milhamot Israel baroma'im acharei החורבן בארץ ישראל ובבבל ובמצרים ובקריניקה ועוד." He's familiar with the history. He says the history of the wars of Israel against the Romans after the destruction, whether in Israel, in Babylonia, in Egypt, in Kiriniki, this in Libya, they are known. The רובם לא היו מרד באומות אלא מרוב העול שהטילו עליהם. That they did not rebel against the nation, but rather could not bear the tax that was laid upon them. This, I don't know if I fully agree with that, because the Bar Kokhba rebellion was not because of the taxes or the tributes, but because they were aspiring to have total freedom and autonomy. But anyway, he goes on to other historical facts. גם בזמן האמוראים והגאונים ועד גירוש ספרד, at the time of the rabbis of the Talmud and the Geonim, and up until the time of the expulsion, גדולי ישראל חסו על כבודם וכבוד הקהילות, וכשהיה באפשרותם השתדלו לעמוד על נפשם נגד צורריהם. The great leaders tried to defend themselves against their enemies. And I would add to that part of defending yourself against your enemies is fleeing. I know that it doesn't sound to us today like, you mean retreat? No, it's not retreating. If you don't have an army and you don't have the military capability to defeat your enemies, then running away is better. Running away, hiding, saving your life, and strategizing for the next move. And that takes us to a. Let me stop 1 second and move from here to another source, and that is Maimonides in Ilchot Yesodei Torah, the laws of the foundation of the Torah. He writes the following. He speaks about when is one obligated to sacrifice his life to sanctify God's name. And here, this is an important line. Kol mi shene'amar bo ya'avor ve'al yareg ve'ne'erag ve'lo avar harei ze mitchayev benafsho. Anyone regarding whom it says that he should transgress the prohibition and not die, but he chose to die instead of transgressing the avira. He says he didn't do a mitzvah, but rather it's a transgression. 1 second. So this is in chapter 5 in Maimonides. Says we are all commanded to sanctify God's name. It says all when we are forced to transgress any of the commandments, ya'avor ve'al yareg. One, if an idolater will force an Israelite to transgress one of the commands of the Torah and threaten him with death for disobedience, it is mandatory that he transgress the commandment and not be put to death. That is the decision of the rabbis. They voted on it. It was not so simple. That's another story that there were those who said you have to sacrifice your life no matter for what. This is God's Torah. You cannot transgress it. And then the rabbis came to the conclusion that you can't do that. You have to survive. That's more important. In Halakha 2, he says, "B'mei dvarim amurim b'shar mitzvot chutz me'avodat kochavim v'gilui arayot u'shfichut damim." This is concerning all other commandments, save idolatry, adultery, and bloodshed. For regarding those 3 commandments, if one is being told, transgress those or we'll kill you, he should rather get killed and not transgress them. This is important to note also that in the original Talmudic discussion, there is a dispute about that. And according to Rabbi Ishmael, idolatry is not included. According to Rabbi Ishmael, if one is being told, we want you to worship idols or die, he should worship idols. That is, I think, amazing, and most amazingly because it's in the Talmud, and most people who study Talmud don't know that. I think I didn't even know. I studied Talmud and never noted that such a deviation, because the way that we were indoctrinated that idolatry is the worst sin, it's blasphemy, it's going against God, and one should die and not do anything that seems like idolatry, never occurred to me before I learned this issue in depth that it doesn't really make sense that God knows what's in my heart. If I worship an idol because I'm forced to, because I want to save my life, God will not be upset because of that. It does, of course, when you look at a historic light, in historical perspective, you say if those people would not have stood up for their values, they would have assimilated. But who knows if those people who did that, if the vote of the rabbis would have gone differently, if they would have said, don't die if you're being told to worship idols, maybe more people would have chosen to superficially worship idols and find a way to escape. However, they decided that this is also included. The other 2 are self-explanatory. We understand that if someone says, kill that person or we kill you, we say, my life is not better than his life. I cannot kill him to save myself. Same for sexual assault. I cannot assault someone to save myself because this is tantamount to murder. And then he goes on to say that if there is a campaign to cause people to abandon Judaism, you sacrifice your life for the smallest thing. However, what's important to us is Halakha 4. כל מי שנאמר בו יעבור ואל ייהרג ונהרג ולא עבר, הרי זה מתחייב בנפשו. Of whom it is said that he shall transgress and not die. If he dies and does not transgress, the guilt is upon his soul. Saying, if one is in a situation where he should not sacrifice his life, like my mother said before, one should sacrifice his life for not committing adultery or sexual assault, right? And let's say one is being told to eat a piece of non-kosher meat, and if he doesn't eat it, he will be killed. What should he do? Halakha is he should eat the meat. What if he chose not to eat the meat? What if he chose to be holier than thou? He decided to be devout and to show his complete dedication and commitment to God and sacrifice his life. Rambam is not impressed. He said there is guilt upon his soul, meaning in the world to come, in the court of where the souls are judged, his soul will be tried for committing suicide. But the Ashkenazi rabbis do not share his view, and they say, if one wants to do that, why not? He has the permission. How can they say that? Where does it come from? Obviously from that difference between Christianity and Judaism, where in one religion it is the highest level of dedication, of devotion, and the other religion does not recognize that. I mean, I know today it might sound a little strange because you think of the shaheed, the people who die for God within Islam, and with that they call themselves witnesses. But this is a recent development, and maybe because of the influence of the historical knowledge and the Christian mentality. But this was not part of the Islamic tradition. The word shaheed as a witness meant someone who recites the shahada, the testimony, saying there's no God but God, etc. So, going back, yes.
That difference between the Ashkenazi and Sephardi regarding martyrdom is particularly jarring to me because, as we know, the Christians draw a direct line from Akedat Yitzchak. You mentioned Akedat Yitzchak.
Yes.
And Jesus, and saying in Jesus, the deed that was interrupted in Akedat Yitzchak has been completed.
Yes.
And so to come from a nation that says no child sacrifice, no human sacrifice, to say, okay, we're adopting martyrdom, to me is very jarring.
Right. And the interesting thing is, like I said, we will discuss later, maybe in the next class, the liturgy about Akedat Yitzchak. I have some recorded classes on that, but I would like to go through this text again in depth. There is in the Sephardic liturgy there are two poems, one written by a Sephardic rabbi, one written by an Ashkenazi rabbi, that have we could say they are a world apart in their worldview of the Akedah. One praises the Akedah and one questions the Akedah, and it's amazing that it made its way into the liturgy of the High Holiday. It's one of the few pieces of liturgy that tells a story. Most of the liturgy of the High Holidays does not contain a story. It's about repentance, about our dialogue with God. This is the story of the Akedah. And the one that made its way into the Tefillah of Rosh Hashanah is the one that questions the whole basis for that. Now, I will add to what you said, Ravita, in terms of the how it affected the Ashkenazi experience. We have to remember also the Crusades. The Crusades were praised for many centuries as the highest level of dedication and devotion that people could show to God. In the late 1980s, 1990s, Professor Yirmiyahu Yuval came, an Israeli historian, presented a theory based on documents from Christian historians of the time of the Crusades that the Christians themselves, the silent majority of Christians who were not swept in within the Crusades, were shocked by the reaction of the Jews, because not only some of them committed suicide, some of them also slaughtered their own children, so they will not be converted to Christianity. And he claimed that was the basis for the birth of the blood libel. That when they start blaming Jews for killing kids in order to use their blood for baking the matzah, so of course there was an uproar in Israel, because it was a sacred thing, something that you don't touch, and also it reflected upon the Holocaust. The Holocaust, we had the same debate where people say that people went to their death, kaseh latevach yuval, as sheep led to the slaughterhouse, and others said that they had no choice. Then, and one reflected upon the other. But when we see the discussion between Maimonides and the Ashkenazi rabbis, whether one is allowed to or not allowed to sacrifice his life for when it's not needed, the question presents itself: can one kill another person to save that person from conversion? Can one kill a child? How can this be justified? And obviously, they acted with full devotion, and not in their mind it was not cruelty. That was the right thing to do. But another thing that unsettled historians up to this point, historians used to put down Sephardic Jews. They said that Spanish Jews were not strong enough because they chose conversion or escape instead of sacrificing their lives for God. And I think that if you ask the question correctly, or you look at the evidence from a different perspective, you say, but what have they achieved? Those people who decided to become Maranos, to become Anusim, for a while, saved their lives and saved future generations. Those who fled Spain and went into the Ottoman Empire, into the Netherlands, and into the New World, and into Europe, they guaranteed the survival of the Jewish people. If they would have all stayed in Spain and said, no, we will die rather than worship when they're becoming Christians, the Ashkenazi Jewry wouldn't exist today, because the influx of Sephardic Jews who came into Europe, they brought new life to Europe as well. But they would all have been annihilated, as happened to many of the great rabbis and scholars in Germany during the Crusades. Right. I mean, it's true. The massacre of the children reminds of the massacre of Masada. The interesting thing is, this is really it takes another turn to this discussion, is that Masada is never mentioned in Talmudic literature. There's total silence. Not once in Mishnaic, Talmudic, Midrashic literature, there's no reference to Masada in any way. And it's interesting because in the modern Zionist, because of the embarrassment, but on the other hand, the Crusades are praised. Why are they not praised? Is it because they committed suicide? There were other people who committed suicide at the same time and are praised in the Talmud. The Talmud brings a story of youth, boys and girls who were taken to Rome to use as sex slaves, and they threw themselves off the ship, committed suicide, and they're praised in the Talmud. But Masada is not, because Masada was a demonstration of strength against the Romans, of rebellion. This they did not praise. This was an act of war. It was unnecessary. It was uncalled for. If they would have accepted the Roman rule and just go to the fields and farm them and pay tribute to the Romans, this would not have happened. But the Crusades, what the Jews did, this was the act of the highest level. This is how it was interpreted for centuries. So this is the new debate in Israel, looking at that. There are some marvelous books on that. Gzerot Tatna, the decrees of 1096, edited by Yom Tov Assis. there are many books now written about it. People are willing to reopen the discussion and look at the textual evidence and the historical evidence to what have gone wrong. And in my mind, there's no doubt that this is the influence of Christianity, both in the sense of putting the Jews down and cornering them into this mentality of victimhood. We are the victims, and we should be the victims, and like the Stockholm syndrome. And the other thing is the way martyrdom is praised in the Christian narrative. There is even a story. There's one case of a scholar in England before the expulsion from England in the 1200s who committed suicide. And they said he was very devout, always spoke about his will to be close to Hashem, and eventually he committed suicide by hanging himself on something called magod. Magod is a cloth hanger that looks very much like a cross. So he sort of hung himself on a cross, and that is like Revita, like you mentioned before, sort of an answer, a response to the accusation of the Christians that the Akedat Yitzhak was never carried out, was never fulfilled. So to that I'll add something else about Akedat Yitzhak. There are three. From my research, I found three. I'm sure there are other examples. Three instances where commentators of Ashkenazi origin try to say that the Akedah, the binding of Yitzhak, the sacrifice, was carried out eventually. Right? The Torah says that it was never carried out, but there are three different points of view. One very ancient, one we say like 100 years ago, that argue that it didn't happen. One of them takes the midrash that says that Sarah died immediately after the Akedah. This is a midrash, the Torah doesn't say that. The Torah writes the story of Sarah's death following the Akedah, but doesn't mean that they happened at the same time. Those are just the events that were worth highlighting. But the midrash says that when Sarah heard that Yitzhak was killed, because this is the message that she received, she fell off the roof and died. We will put aside the problem with this midrash, throwing Sarah off the roof, when, as far as we know from Tanakh, she always lived in a tent, and it's very hard to fall off the roof of a tent to your death. So that is a separate issue. But in medieval times, one of the Baalei Tosafot explains it differently. He says when Sarah heard that Yitzhak did not die, she thought to herself that her sacrifice is rejected, and because of her sorrow, she died. So she becomes now the sacrifice. You realize that if the Christians come and accuse the Jews, you never sacrifice, you're still like, no, Sarah did. She died for Isaac. This is one interpretation. Another interesting interpretation that made itself into the liturgy of medieval times is that Abraham did slaughter Yitzhak. And there's of course, no proof for that in the text, but the Midrash developed that in a Midrashic way to say that Abraham killed Yitzhak, and then God revived Yitzhak. And after God revived Yitzhak, Abraham says, what is going on here? It's not working. Let me kill him again. And then the divine river Nahar Dinu, or something like that, swept Yitzhak up to heaven, away from his father who was trying to kill him. And only after Abraham promised that he's not going to kill him, he brought him back. Actually, there's another, and maybe another, but there's also in the same vein that says that Abraham was trying to negotiate with God. When God says, don't kill him, Abraham said, but maybe I could draw some blood to show that he was still willing to do it. And then finally, there's a commentary by I think it's the Sochachover Rebbe in the 19th or early 20th century, who says the following: the juxtaposition of the Akedah right after the binding of Yitzhak, when at the end of the story, we read that Avraham is being told that his brother had children and grandchildren. And he thinks to himself that if the Akedah would be carried out, Yitzhak would have died without children. And that would have been it would be a shame. So it's about time to get Yitzhak married. That is the original Midrash. The author of this book, Shem Mishmuel, interprets completely differently. He says that why did Avraham decide now to get Yitzhak married? Because he was thinking this. He says, if Yitzhak were married, then he would have had children. If he would have had children, the blessing, the promise that God gave me that I will have descended from Yitzhak would have been fulfilled with his children, and I would still be able to sacrifice him. God, this is really a little like, convoluted. Avraham says, the only reason that I wasn't able to sacrifice Yitzhak is that he had no children, but if he had children, I would be able to do it. And that is a little, but this is how far the theology of, we must argue that the Akedah did happen, how far it went. And that is, like I said, this is part of the problem.
By the way, I just looked it up because I was curious. I thought I remembered something like that. Chapter 22 in Bereshit, for the chapter that tells about the Akedah. Verse 19 says, "Vayashav Abraham et Ne'av."
Right, without Yitzhak.
Abraham came back.
Yes, that could be it, or that could be that he came back alone, or it could be that could be. Also, like I wrote this week about the parasha that Sarah dies in another place. Could be just the fact that they separate. Maybe Yitzhak didn't want to go back with him. Maybe he was afraid. I would be afraid, no matter what age. Even though according to Ibn Ezra it was 12 or 13, he could have been terrified. Why? Why would he go back with him? I wrote an article, Sarah's Diaries. Did you read that? Remind me. Send me an email. Remind me to send it to you. Like I've tried to imagine Sarah writing a diary the day after Avraham leaves for the Akedah, and she realizes that he takes the wood and he takes the knife, and she starts suspecting something, and she runs after him. And what if she gets to the mountain, and she sees it like just from the slope when he raises his hand? What a terrifying sight must have been for her. And like you said, this is unfortunate that the original message of the Akedah was God does not want human sacrifices. Maybe we'll conclude with that, because we have to go back to the Teshuvah rabbi-toledano and analyze it in depth. It's a very, very fascinating Teshuvah and opens up to so many issues. But let us open one biblical text that sheds light on the Akedah, because the best commentary for the Bible is the Bible itself. This is the best commentary. So let's look at the famous, there's a famous statement in Micha at the end of the book of Micha, regarding what is it that God wants from us. You know the famous quote, Higid lecha Adam matov uma Adonai Elohecha doresh me'imach. So what is it that God wants from you, right? The ki'im asod mishpat ve'avat chesed ve'asnei alechet im Elohecha. So this is in chapter 6, verse 8, right? The Navi says this, Sigid lecha Adam tov, if it hath been told you, O man, what is good, and what does Hashem require of you, only to do justice and love mercy and walk humbly with God. Beautiful. I love this verse. It's my email signature. But if you go back 2 verses, go to verse 6. One asks, this is the question that the person asks, the prophet asks for us. Bama akadem Adonai ikaf le'Elohim arom. Wherewith shall I come before Hashem and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before Him with burnt offerings, with calves of a year old? And the answer is no. Verse 7, Hayirtzeh Adonai be'alfei elim, will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams? No. Berivevot nachalei shamen, with 10,000 rivers of oil? No. Ha'eten bechori pishei, shall I give my firstborn for my transgression? No. Peri bitni hatat nafshi, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? No. It had been told you, O men, what is good. This is the greatest commentary on the Akedah. Anyone who asks whether the Bible is for or against human or against the Akedah, this is the direct reference. Micha is commenting on Avraham. Avraham is the one who is doing mishpat v'hesed. And he says this is what God wanted. That God did not want him to bring his firstborn or his secondborn or any child as an atonement, as a sacrifice, as a gift. This is not necessary. Not the sacrifices are necessary. So we'll conclude with that. There's much more to speak about that, and we'll continue with the Shuvah of Rabbi-Toledano next week, God willing.